France before 1789 was a composite of institutions, obligations, and inequalities that had hardened over centuries. Governmental authority was centralized in the person of the king, but that authority operated through an array of intermediary bodies: provincial courts and parliaments, local seigneuries, municipal corporations, church structures, and administrative offices often sold as venal posts. Society was formally divided into three estates. The first estate, the clergy, held legal privileges, collected tithes in many regions, and managed large landholdings. The second estate, the nobility, held seigneurial rights, exemptions from many direct taxes, and preferential access to military and court offices. The third estate encompassed everyone else: peasants, urban laborers, artisans, shopkeepers, and the rising bourgeoisie of merchants, financiers, and professionals. The third estate was not homogeneous. Wealthy bourgeois merchants in cities were socially and economically distinct from rural poor who subsisted on small plots and seasonal labor. Fiscal strain was the immediate, visible problem. For decades, the crown's expenditures exceeded its revenues. Military commitments, including the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and the substantial subsidy and material support for the American War of Independence, 1778 to 1783, had increased the national debt. Attempts to service that debt relied in part on loans and on revenues that were uneven and vulnerable to harvests and market fluctuations. Taxation relied heavily on indirect and regressive levies. The taille, a direct land tax in many regions but unevenly applied. Indirect taxes on salt and goods, such as the gabelle, and a system of seigneurial dues and fees. Many nobles and much of the clerical hierarchy enjoyed tax exemptions or paid reduced assessments. Municipal and provincial fiscal regimes were fragmented. Those features meant the state's ability to raise new revenue faced institutional and political barriers. Successive ministers of finance and reformers proposed changes that ran into entrenched resistance. And Robert Jacques Turgot served as Controller General from 1774 to 1776 and sought to liberalize grain trade, reduce guild restrictions, and cut court expenditures. His measures faced opposition from privileged groups and court factions, and he was dismissed in 1776. Charles Alexander de Calonne, appointed Controller General in 1783, proposed sweeping reforms in 1786, a single land tax to replace many privileges, abolition of internal customs barriers, and other measures intended to modernize revenue collection. Calonne judged that the nobility and provincial assemblies would accept a general tax only if they participated in and recognized a new fiscal settlement. The Assembly of Notables that Calonne convened in February 1787 rejected his program. That assembly of high-ranking nobles, bishops, and officials insisted that any new tax required approval by the traditional institutions, and their refusal exposed the limits on ministerial authority. Calonne was dismissed. His successor, the Archbishop and Minister Étienne Charles de Loménie de Brienne, also failed to secure sustainable reforms. Public petitions, pamphlets, and growing press commentary intensified the debate. Jacques Necker, who had earlier produced the Compte Rendu au Roi in 1781, a publicized account of royal finances intended to build confidence in the crown's solvency, returned to power in 1788. Necker promoted public accounting and sought to mobilize credit, but he too encountered the same structural barriers. These ministerial failures intersected with a peasant and urban economy that had become fragile. The 1780s produced variable harvests across France. The year 1788 is widely recorded as a year of poor harvests in many grain-producing regions. Weather problems and poor harvests in 1788 produced shortages and raised the price of grain, the primary staple. Urban consumers, particularly in Paris, spend a large share of their income on bread. Small increases in bread price produced immediate hardship and heightened popular discontent. Rural populations faced persistent obligations, seigneurial dues, corvée labor on roads, banalites, fees for the use of seigneurial mills or ovens, and tithes payable to the church. Those obligations eroded household resilience to price shocks. Political culture had been changing for decades. The growth of a public sphere, newspapers, pamphlets, salons, coffee houses, and academies spread ideas and criticism more widely than in earlier decades. Enlightenment writers and philosophes articulated critiques of absolute rule, hereditary privilege, and ecclesiastical authority. Montesquieu de l'Esprit de l'Os, 1748, analyzed the separation of powers and criticized arbitrary government. Rousseau's Du Contrat Social, 1762, argued the legitimacy of government derived from the general will and consent of the governed. Voltaire criticized clerical privilege and defended free expression. The Encyclopédie, edited by Diderot and D'Alembert, published in parts between 1751 and 1772, gathered scientific, technical, and philosophical knowledge and embodied a secular, critical approach to inherited authorities. These works were not direct manuals for revolution, but they supplied vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that critics of the Ancien regime used to argue for legal equality, accountability, and civic rights. Pamphlets and political essays were widely circulated in the 1780s. Some, such as Emmanuel Joseph Size's Chuesc, Luthiers État, January 1789, framed the Third Estate as the nation's active core and demanded political recognition. Institutions that mediated elite politics worked against rapid reform. The parliaments, provincial judicial bodies, most prominently the Parliament of Paris, functioned as legal courts but also as bodies that registered royal edicts. In the 1770s and 1780s, parliaments increasingly asserted the need for the crown to consult broader representative bodies before imposing new taxes. When the crown sought to push through new fiscal measures, parliaments resisted, often demanding reforms that implied curtailing ministerial authority. That resistance shaped a constitutional dilemma. The monarchy needed new revenue, but lacked the political means to impose taxes without appearing arbitrary or illegal to influential elites and to public opinion. Administrative structure magnified the problem. France was divided into provinces and generalities with uneven financial capacities and local customs. There was no single national census or consistent system of land valuation across the kingdom. The absence of a reliable, centralized apparatus for revenue assessment and collection made it difficult both to measure the crisis precisely and to implement uniform solutions. Reformers proposed standardization of weights and measures and the elimination of internal trade barriers. Such measures threatened localized vested interests and required political authorization that the crown could not secure without popular or institutional assent. Economic changes in the broader Atlantic economy also mattered. Merchant and financial classes had grown in wealth and influence. Commercial credit, expanding commerce, and colonial trade produced wealth that the state sometimes tapped, but also that created distinct interests. Merchants who favored free trade versus guilds, and corporations that protected narrow commercial privileges. The bourgeoisie increasingly sought political recognition commensurate with economic power. That demand intersected with clerical and noble privileges to create a three-way tension: elites resisting fiscal reform, a bourgeoisie seeking political voice, and a broad third estate suffering economic burden. Cultural practices reinforced social distinctions. Venality of offices, the sale of judicial and administrative positions, allowed wealthy bourgeois to purchase status, but also entrenched a system where official posts secured revenue for holders and reduced incentives for reform of public finance. The legal system's complex patchwork of customary law, coutumes, in the North and Roman law traditions in the South meant that rights, obligations, and procedures varied regionally. That regional legal diversity complicated any attempt to institute a uniform national code or consistent tax base. By the late 1780s, public confidence in the monarchy's capacity to govern effectively had eroded. The circulation of financial reports, the publicization of debates over taxation, and popular pamphleteering meant political disputes were not confined to court corridors. Street-level sensations, the visibility of royal extravagance at Versailles contrasted with market shortages in Paris, intensified perceptions of a regime out of touch with national needs. Political actors on all sides anticipated a convocation of broader representation. The Estates General, a medieval institution that had not been called since 1614, was widely discussed as a means to settle the fiscal question with legitimacy. In parallel, organized groups and informal networks proliferated. Provincial assemblies and local estates prepared lists of grievances, cahiers de doléances, in anticipation of a national consultation. Intellectuals, municipal notables, and professional associations debated what representation should mean: votes by order or votes by head, the role of the clergy and nobility, and the legal status of the commoners. These debates were not merely abstract. They shaped expectations and mobilized actors who would act quickly once the Estates General was called. The final months before 1789 witnessed an acute fiscal crunch and accelerating political preparation. The Crown's decision to summon the Estates General in 1788 and formally to open it in May 1789 was a response to an impasse. Ministers could not secure reforms through existing institutions, and the king sought a broader mandate for new taxes. That decision set in motion the formal confrontation between an ancient regime whose institutions defended privileges and a political culture in which ideas of legal equality and public sovereignty were now widely circulated and actively claimed. The structural pressures, financial insolvency, harvest failures, and rising bread prices, institutional resistance to reform, the growth of a politically literate public sphere, and the mobilization of provincial grievances combined to produce conditions in which a convocation of representatives could not simply rubber stamp royal fiscal policy, but would instead become an arena for constitutional transformation. On May 5th, 1789, the King's summons of the Estates General opened a political process intended to solve a fiscal emergency and instead set in motion a constitutional transformation. The Estates General was an institutional assembly with medieval origins composed of three orders: the clergy, First Estate; the nobility, Second Estate; and the commoners, Third Estate. It was not a modern parliament. Its procedures and norms reflected centuries of privilege and local custom. The Crown called it because ministers could not secure the necessary revenue through existing means. The expectation among many was that the Estates General would approve new taxes. But the convocation also provided a formal space where previously dispersed grievances, pamphlets, and regional claims could be made public and contrasted. In the months before the opening, local elections and preparations produced an extraordinary volume of written complaints and proposals known as the Cahiers de doléances. These documents, drawn up in towns, rural communities, and provincial estates, recorded demands that ranged from local administrative reforms to broad constitutional ideas. Complaints about seigneurial dues, calls for equal taxation, demands for clearer legal codes, and appeals for limits on arbitrary royal authority. The Cahiers demonstrated that, across the kingdom, the language of rights and proportional representation had penetrated municipal and provincial debate. The question of procedure dominated the early days of the Estates General. Traditionally, the three orders voted separately, with each order casting one collective vote. That system preserved the privileges of the clergy and nobility because a united First and Second Estate could outvote the Third. Many representatives of the Third Estate pressed instead for voting by head. That is, individual deputies counted equally so that the larger number of Third Estate deputies would carry decisions. They also pressed for doubling the Third Estate's representation as a concession to the size of France's common population. These demands were not merely technical. They framed whether the assembly would function as a body that could enact meaningful reform or whether it would confirm the existing structure of privilege. As negotiations over procedure stalled, the Common Estate deputies took a decisive step. On June 17, 1789, representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the nation as a whole and asserting their right to institute a constitution. That declaration reframed legitimacy. Authority, the National Assembly said, derived from the nation rather than from traditional orders. The move directly challenged the established order and placed pressure on the king and the other estates. The Third Estate invited sympathetic clergy and a minority of liberal nobles to join them. A number did, and the body's character shifted from purely a bourgeois pressure group to a negotiating National Assembly. On June 20, 1789, after being locked out of their usual meeting hall, the deputies of the newly proclaimed National Assembly gathered at an indoor tennis court at Versailles and took an oath, the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had produced a constitution for France. The oath functioned as a public, political pledge. It also signaled a procedural break with the Ancien regime's methods of governance. The king's response in the following days was ambiguous. Louis XVI moved troops toward Versailles and Paris, a posture the public interpreted as threatening. At the same time, some high-ranking officials signaled a willingness to negotiate. The combination of uncertainty and visible royal military posture helped to radicalize Parisian public opinion. Urban unrest in Paris escalated. Food shortages, rising bread prices, and the perception that royal troops were preparing to suppress popular activity intensified popular mobilization. On July 14, 1789, a large crowd attacked and captured the Bastille fortress and prison in Paris. The Bastille held a small complement of troops, a contested cache of arms, and a handful of prisoners. Its symbolic value, as a royal fortress and instrument of arbitrary power, far exceeded its military significance. The governor, Bernard-René de Launay, was captured and later killed by the crowd. The fall of the Bastille reverberated across the kingdom. It demonstrated that popular force could influence political outcomes and that Parisian public opinion could no longer be ignored. The event prompted the king to recall Necker and to make gestures meant to soothe the capital, but it also encouraged other local actions of assertion. After the Bastille, political authority in Paris underwent rapid reconfiguration. A municipality, the Paris Commune, emerged, composed of local notables and militants who organized the city's administration. The National Guard, a citizen militia with Lafayette as a prominent military leader, formed when municipal authorities sought to create an armed but civic force to maintain order and protect the revolution's gains. These institutions channeled popular energy into bodies that claimed both civic legitimacy and the capacity to provide security and structure. The countryside reacted in parallel to events in the capital. In July and August of 1789, a wave of rural disturbances known collectively as the Great Fear swept through many provinces. Rumors circulated that brigands or aristocratic plots aimed to destroy popular livelihoods and restore feudal repression. The reality varied by district. Some uprisings were spontaneous, driven by desperate peasants acting against local seigneurial courts and symbols of seigneurial exactions. Others were organized to seize grain or to burn feudal records. In many areas, peasants attacked manor houses or forced landlords to renounce seigneurial dues. The Great Fear was not a single, centrally directed movement. It reflected local conditions, harvest failures, local grievances, amplified by rumor networks and reaction to events in Paris. The scale of the rural unrest convinced many deputies in the National Assembly that feudal burdens posed a national threat. Confronted with urban and rural upheaval, the National Assembly met in a critical session on the night of August 4th, 1789. Deputies debated sweeping proposals to eliminate feudal obligations and many hereditary privileges. In a series of consecutive declarations that night, the Assembly abolished seigneurial dues, corvée labor obligations, venality of offices, and other feudal incidents. The abolition was not a uniform elimination of all local practices instantly. It created a legal rupture that nullified the institutional basis of noble privilege. The night's acts were as much legal and political as they were symbolic. They transformed rights and obligations rooted in centuries into subjects of national law. The phrase, abolition of feudalism, has a specific meaning here. The Assembly abolished legal forms of feudal dues and privileges that had subordinated commoners to lords under hereditary law. On August 26, 1789, the National Assembly promulgated the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The Declaration summarized key principles to guide constitutional government: equality before the law, protection of natural rights, liberty, property, security, the principle that sovereignty resides in the nation, legal protections such as the presumption of innocence, equality of taxation, and freedom of speech and religion within the limits of the law. The Declaration drew on Enlightenment principles and, to some extent, on the American Revolution's language of rights and consent. It did not itself codify a full constitutional order, but provided a foundation of norms intended to bind future legislation and administration. Political practices in the summer of 1789 also included mobilization for representation and political club formation. In Paris and elsewhere, political clubs and societies formed where citizens debated public affairs, organized petitions, and coordinated local actions. The press expanded rapidly. Newspapers and pamphlets disseminated debates and criticisms widely, creating a public sphere in which national politics became a topic accessible to more people than ever before. The economic underpinning of political unrest remained constant. After poor harvests and rising bread prices, urban consumers and rural laborers had little margin for further shocks. Food riots and market unrest continued through the year. That material pressure gave political claims an immediate basis. Calls for relief, fair grain distribution, and an end to privileges that made bread prices artificially high carried political significance and forced the assembly to address both constitutional and immediate economic issues. The political relationship between the king and the assembly evolved through the late summer and autumn. Louis XVI accepted, in pragmatic terms, some measures but resisted others. He recognized the National Assembly on June 27, 1789, after a period of hesitant maneuvering and public pressure, and he later sanctioned some acts to stabilize the situation. Nonetheless, his continued association with ministerial figures perceived as unsympathetic to reform and the presence of troops around the capital undermined trust. That political ambiguity would have consequences in subsequent months. The unrest culminated in another decisive popular movement in October. On October 5 to 6, 1789, in what is commonly called the Women's March on Versailles, groups of market women and urban insurgents traveled to Versailles to demand bread and to insist that the king address the capital's economic plight. Facing pressure and fearing further disorder, the royal family moved from Versailles to Paris and took up residence at the Tuileries Palace on October 6, 1789. The king's physical presence in Paris placed him under closer public scrutiny and made the center of political gravity shift from Versailles to the capital. By the end of 1789, the Ancien regime's political foundations had been substantially altered. The Estates General had become the National Assembly, which had abolished feudal privileges and proclaimed the rights that would guide constitutional development. Popular action in the capital and countryside had shown that political authority depended on more than royal decree. These transformations set the legal and political framework for further constitutional work and complicated any return to the previous order. The months between May and October 1789 combined procedural disputes about representation, public pledges to draft a constitution, symbolic ruptures such as the fall of the Bastille, collective abolition of feudal institutions, and the transfer of the monarchy to Paris, all of which converted a fiscal crisis into a constitutional revolution. On July 12, 1790, the National Constituent Assembly passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, a law that remade the relationship between the French state and the Catholic Church. The law reorganized dioceses to match the new administrative departments, made bishops and parish priests elective by local assemblies, placed clergy on state payrolls, and required an oath of loyalty to the Constitution. The assembly's intent was administrative and political, to bring ecclesiastical structures under national control, supply the state with revenue through the sale of church lands, and to break the institutional autonomy that had placed the church outside direct legislative authority. The civil constitution produced an immediate and long-lasting schism. A substantial minority of clergy refused to swear the required oath. Those who refused were known as non-jurors or refractory priests, while those who accepted were called juring or constitutional clergy. The papacy condemned the measure, and subsequent papal pronouncements forbade the clergy from accepting the law. The split created pastoral confusion in parishes, hardened regional resistance where popular religious practice remained strong, and converted religious allegiance into a marker of political reliability. The Assembly's religious reforms were part of a broader program of administrative and legal reorganization that the constituent body pursued between 1789 and 1791. The ancient provincial divisions, parliaments, and corporate privileges were dismantled and replaced with a uniform territorial structure of departments, districts, cantons, and communes. The new departments were designed for equal size and easier central control. They became the basic unit for taxation, justice, and local administration. Judicial reform reduced the political role of the old parliaments, replaced venal judicial offices with salaried judges, and reorganized courts into a hierarchical system intended to secure impartiality and standard procedure. These measures aimed to convert localized, customary practices into a single national law space, and to remove the particular legal privileges that had obstructed consistent fiscal and legal policy. Economic measures accompanied administrative change. The Assembly nationalized church property to satisfy immediate fiscal need and issued assignats, initially government bonds secured on nationalized lands, that quickly became a circulating paper medium. The assignat policy provided short-term liquidity and financed the revolutionary government. But the Assembly repeatedly authorized additional issues in 1790 to 1791. By late 1791, assignats had begun to depreciate, creating inflationary pressure that affected urban consumers and small producers. The Assembly also sought to dismantle corporate restrictions on production and trade. The Le Chapelier Law, adopted on June 14, 1791, banned guilds, prohibited workers' coalitions and strikes, and asserted the principle of free economic activity by individuals. The law reflected the Assembly's ideological commitment to individual property rights and market freedom, but it also curtailed collective mechanisms for worker defense and removed organized channels through which skilled artisans could protect wages and conditions. The interaction of assignat inflation, market reform, and the loss of collective safeguards increased economic insecurity for many urban workers. Political design in the Constitution of 1791 embodied a compromise between revolutionary principle and conservative caution. The Constitution, drafted by the Constituent Assembly and completed in early September 1791, established a constitutional, hereditary monarchy with a separation of powers and a unicameral legislature called the Legislative Assembly. The charter limited political participation to active citizens. Male citizens at least 25 years old who paid direct taxes above a set threshold, commonly framed as a contribution equal to 3 days' labor. Passive citizens, women, the poor, servants, and others who did not meet these qualifications, retained civil rights, but not political rights. The franchise was therefore restricted and indirect. Active citizens elected electors, who in turn chose deputies. The Constitution placed the executive authority formally in the king, but curtailed his powers by subjecting royal acts to countersignature by ministers who were responsible to the legislature, and by allowing the assembly the authority to initiate and approve laws and the budget. The new political system attempted to balance stability, property protection, and representative legitimacy. It did so at the cost of excluding a sizable portion of the adult population from formal political participation. Institutional and political factionalism hardened in the months following these reforms. Clubs and clubs networks multiplied. The Jacobin Club, originally a provincial network, turned national forum. The Cordeliers and other popular societies remained influential as forums for political debate and mobilization. Many deputies who had earlier supported constitutional limits grew concerned about the intensity of street politics and, after the king's attempted escape, split from more radical circles. The flight to Varennes on the night of June 20th to 21st, 1791, when Louis XVI and his family attempted to reach a royalist stronghold at Montmedy but were captured at Varennes, was decisive. The flight exposed the monarch's willingness to abandon revolutionary constraints and seek foreign support. Public reaction was severe. Confidence in the monarchy declined sharply, moderates lost credibility, and political debate shifted from procedural reform to questions about the very existence of the monarchy. The king's attempted flight produced both immediate political consequences. The political consequences of the king's flight were immediate and violent at the level of street politics. On July 17, 1791, the Champ de Mars demonstration, organized by Republicans and popular leaders who demanded the king's removal, ended with the National Guard ordered by the Mayor Jean-Sylvain Bailly and under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette opening fire on demonstrators. Estimates of the dead range from a dozen to 50. The incident damaged Lafayette's reputation, strengthened the hand of moderate constitutionalists who favored order, and provoked a split in the revolutionary movement that produced the fuelent group of moderate constitutional monarchists. The Champ de Mars episode illustrated the expanding gap between parliamentary procedures and popular politics. Even as the assembly worked through constitutional technicalities, crowds in the capital and provincial centers pressed for immediate, radical solutions. Diplomatically, the revolution's domestic developments encouraged émigré activity and provoked foreign responses. Many nobles, clergy, and officers chose exile over accepting the revolution's legal changes. Émigrés gathered at foreign courts, lobbied for intervention, and prepared military contingencies. Their presence and appeals contributed to the Declaration of Pillnitz on August 27, 1791, in which Emperor Leopold II of the Holy Roman Empire and King Frederick William II of Prussia issued a public statement expressing concern for Louis XVI and intimating that European powers might act if the French monarchy were threatened. The Pillnitz statement was framed as conditional and cautious, but within France, it was read as a threat and used by political actors to argue for defensive measures, including preemptive war. The émigré communities, the papal rebuke to the civil constitution, and foreign diplomatic declarations combined to internationalize what had begun as an internal constitutional crisis. The Constituent Assembly's legislative record through 1791 was extensive and technical. Laws reorganized judicial procedure, codified new fiscal arrangements, created secular civic registers for births and marriages, revised municipal government, and defined civil rights and property protections. The Assembly also enacted laws to regulate church property confiscation, restrict clerical titles and commands, and manage the transition of thousands of ecclesiastical offices into state administration. The pace and texture of reform produced administrative burdens, elections to fill new offices, disputes over the legitimacy of elected bishops and priests, local contestation when constitutional clergy attempted to occupy parishes where refusal and non-cooperation persisted, and fiscal strain as the state attempted to sell confiscated lands while managing currency needs. The political environment also saw the emergence of a new vocabulary of rights and legal authority. The language of constitutionalism, popular sovereignty, active citizenship, written laws, separation of powers, entered ordinary political practice. Yet the legal mechanisms the Assembly adopted did not resolve economic grievances or political loyalties. Bread prices, assignat depreciation, and the loss of collective protections for workers kept social tensions high. The abolition of corporate guilds and the legal prohibition of worker associations left many urban laborers politically unprotected while removing institutions that had formerly regulated apprenticeship and quality. The law's ideological commitment to individual enterprise and property security was, at the same time, perceived by many workers as a removal of social safeguards. By late September 1791, when the National Constituent Assembly promulgated the Constitution and prepared to dissolve itself on September 30th, 1791, the institutional landscape had been transformed but remained deeply unstable. The Constitution established formal legal structures and a reconfigured monarchy, but the flight of the king, the clerical schism, decrees such as Le Chapeliers, the assignat inflation, and popular mobilizations had changed political expectations and alignments. Factional lines between Feuillants and Jacobins, between constitutionalists and republicans, between juring and refractory clergy, were clearly drawn and would influence the next phase of events under the Legislative Assembly. The immediate task of governance shifted from drafting a constitution to attempting to implement large-scale social, economic, and ecclesiastical reforms under conditions of distrust, economic strain, and intensifying foreign peril. The Legislative Assembly, inaugurated on October 1st, 1791, replaced the dissolved Constituent Assembly and inherited a revolution already divided and fragile. Its 745 deputies were new to office. None of the former deputies could serve, by prior decree, to prevent entrenched influence. The composition reflected the new political spectrum. The Feuillants represented constitutional monarchists seeking to stabilize the revolution under the 1791 Constitution. The Girondins, a loosely organized group of Republican-leaning deputies, favored expansive political reform and viewed war as a means to defend and spread revolutionary principles. And the Jacobins, whose ranks increasingly drew from radical clubs and urban sections, supported more direct democracy and harsh measures against perceived counter-revolutionaries. The Assembly confronted an immediate dilemma. France was internally divided and externally threatened. The civil constitution of the clergy had split communities across the nation. Resistance among refractory priests created rural unrest, especially in western regions such as the Vade and Brittany. Economic conditions remained unstable. Inflation of the assignat currency eroded purchasing power, and bread shortages continued to cause unrest in Paris and provincial towns. The new administrative system demanded thousands of elections and officials, yet local inexperience and uneven acceptance of reforms slowed implementation. The king, though still formally head of state, was distrusted by many after the flight to Varennes. His correspondence with émigré nobles and relatives abroad fueled suspicions of royal collusion with foreign powers. Diplomatic tensions with Austria and Prussia intensified through late 1791 and early 1792. The émigrés concentrated at Koblenz under the leadership of the king's brothers, the Comte d'Artois and the Comte de Provence, agitated for a military intervention to restore royal authority. The Declaration of Pillnitz in August 1791, though cautiously worded, had already alarmed French opinion. Inside the assembly, the Girondins argued that war would expose internal traitors, unify the nation, and spread revolutionary ideals abroad. Deputies such as Jacques-Pierre Brisset and Jean-Marie Roland pushed for hostilities, asserting that monarchies of Europe aimed to suppress liberty. The Feuillants and some moderates warned against military adventurism, citing an unprepared army, a divided officer corps, and depleted finances. The army itself was unstable. Since 1789, thousands of aristocratic officers had emigrated, leaving gaps in command. Revolutionary decrees had introduced a new hierarchy of citizen soldiers and elected officers, but cohesion and discipline were weak. Desertions were frequent, supply chains disorganized, and morale uncertain. Despite this, revolutionary enthusiasm among volunteers, later called faders, provided new manpower. Propaganda and patriotic songs, notably the chant de guerre pour l'armée du Rhin, soon to be known as La Marseillaise, reflected a growing sense of national defense. On April 20th, 1792, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria, inaugurating what would become the War of the First Coalition. The motion passed with support from the king's ministers, ironically, including some royalists who believed defeat would strengthen the monarchy's position. Prussia joined Austria in July. The early campaigns went poorly for France. French forces under General Rochambeau and General Lafayette were disorganized and often mutinous. At Tournai, Mons, and Nervin, troops fled under pressure, and rumors of treason among officers circulated widely. The failure of initial offensives, combined with fears of internal conspiracy, radicalized political discourse. The king dismissed Girondin ministers in June, and public confidence collapsed further. The revolutionary government responded with emergency measures. The Assembly decreed the mobilization of 20,000 faders to Paris for national defense and passed laws targeting refractory priests and émigrés. The king vetoed these laws, invoking his constitutional right, which deepened mistrust and provoked popular outrage. On June 20th, 1792, Parisian crowds invaded the Tuileries Palace, confronting the king directly and forcing him to wear a red liberty cap. Though violence was limited, the invasion exposed the monarchy's vulnerability and the capital's shifting power toward the street and the clubs. By July, foreign invasion became imminent. The Brunswick Manifesto, issued on July 25, 1792, by the Duke of Brunswick commanding the Austro-Prussian army, warned that if the royal family were harmed, Paris would face severe retribution. The threat inflamed revolutionary sentiment rather than subduing it. Paris sections and radical clubs demanded the monarchy's overthrow. On August 10, 1792, insurgents from the Paris Commune, National Guard, and faders stormed the Tuileries. The Swiss guard defending the palace was massacred. The royal family fled to the Legislative Assembly, which suspended the monarchy and later imprisoned the king and queen in the temple. The insurrection marked the de facto end of the constitutional monarchy and the emergence of popular sovereignty enforced by armed citizens. In the aftermath, a revolutionary commune dominated Paris, and the Assembly decreed the election of a national convention to draft a republican constitution. The atmosphere was one of suspicion and vengeance. Between September 2nd to 6th, 1792, news that foreign armies had captured Verdun, combined with fears of counter-revolutionary conspiracies inside Paris prisons, led to the September massacres. Revolutionary crowds, led by radical militants, executed more than 1,000 prisoners, many ordinary criminals, but also clergy and suspected royalists, without trial. The killings were not officially sanctioned, but tolerated by radical leaders as expressions of patriotic vigilance. The massacres shocked foreign observers and hardened the perception of France as descending into chaos. Meanwhile, the war turned unexpectedly in France's favor. At Valmy, on September 20th, 1792, the French army under Generals Dumouriez and Kellerman repelled the Prussian advance. Though tactically minor, the battle had immense symbolic impact. The Revolutionary Army had held firm against Europe's most disciplined troops. Goethe, witnessing the event, later remarked that a new era in history had begun. The next day, September 21st, the National Convention convened and unanimously abolished the monarchy, proclaiming the French Republic. The Constitution of 1791 was nullified, and time itself was reset. The year 1792 was declared Year I of the Republic. The convention faced the question of the deposed king's fate. A trial opened in December 1792, with evidence drawn from seized correspondence that suggested Louis XVI had conspired with foreign powers. Deputies debated his inviolability under the Constitution and whether a public vote was required for sentencing. The convention found him guilty of treason by a large majority. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, formerly Place Louis XV. The act abolished the symbolic foundation of monarchy in France and transformed the revolution into a republic sustained by coercion and ideology rather than tradition. Europe reacted with alarm. Britain, the Dutch Republic, Spain, and several Italian states joined Austria and Prussia in a new coalition against France. The War of the First Coalition expanded dramatically in 1793. Inside France, royalist uprisings erupted, most significantly the Vaude Rebellion, beginning in March 1793, where rural peasants, refractory clergy, and local nobles opposed conscription and the anti-clerical policies of the Republic. revolutionary forces faced both external invasion and civil war. To suppress internal dissent, the convention created the Committee of Public Safety in April 1793, granting it extensive powers over war, finance, and internal security. By mid-1793, France was fighting for survival on all fronts. The army suffered reverses in Belgium and along the Rhine, and Toulon invited the British fleet. Economic distress deepened, inflation accelerated, and food scarcity returned. The Paris Commune and sans-culottes demanded radical measures, price controls, requisitions, and purges of counter-revolutionaries. The Girondins, who resisted popular pressure, were expelled from the convention in June 1793 after a Parisian insurrection. Power consolidated in the Montagnards, led by Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, though internal divisions soon followed. The Constitution of 1793, adopted on June 24th, declared universal male suffrage and social rights, but was never implemented. Emergency governance under the Committee of Public Safety took precedence. France entered the phase later termed the Reign of Terror, a system of revolutionary government meant to enforce loyalty and defeat all enemies, internal and external. Arrests, tribunals, and executions expanded rapidly under the laws of September 17 and October 10, 1793, establishing the law of suspects and centralized authority of the Revolutionary Tribunal. By late 1793, the revolution had completed its transformation from constitutional reform to ideological republic under wartime coercion. The monarchy was gone, the church subordinated, and a mass army mobilized in defense of the nation. The combined effect of war, internal rebellion, and political radicalization defined this stage as the crucible in which modern revolutionary government was forged. On 9 Thermidor Year 2, July 27, 1794, the political equilibrium that had bound revolutionary government together collapsed. The system of revolutionary terror, centralized under the Committee of Public Safety, had relied on emergency powers, summary tribunals, and extraordinary legislation to defeat internal and external enemies. Those measures also created rivalries and fear inside the revolutionary leadership. The arrest of Maximilien Robespierre and his closest allies on 9 Thermidor, followed by their execution on 10 Thermidor, July 28, 1794, ended the reign of terror as an instrument of government. The immediate aftermath was a decisive rout of the machinery that had concentrated power in a handful of men. The Revolutionary Tribunal was curtailed, the most draconian laws were repealed, and many of the instruments of extraordinary jurisdiction were dismantled. The Thermidorian reaction that followed was political, social, and administrative. Deputies who had opposed the terror sought to restore legal procedures, roll back economic controls associated with the Committee of Public Safety, and reduce the reach of popular committees and sans-culotte influence. Many Jacobins and local militants were expelled from office, imprisoned, or prosecuted. Clubs that had mobilized popular power were restricted, and the convention attempted to reassert bourgeois Republican control. This period also produced a counter-reaction of its own, a white terror, in some regions where targets associated with the terror were attacked by local opponents. The Thermidorian settlement did not restore Ancien regime privileges, but it did shift the revolution from emergency governance toward a more conservative parliamentary republicanism. Political instability continued despite the reaction. The convention sought a constitutional settlement that would prevent both the return of the Jacobin dictatorship and the restoration of the monarchy. The result was the Constitution of Year 3, drafted and adopted in August 1795. The Constitution created a bicameral legislature, the Council of 500 as the lower body and the Council of Ancients as the upper, together designed to slow radical legislative waves. Executive power was entrusted not to a single individual, but to a collegial body of 5 directors, known as the Directory. The franchise in Year 3 remained restricted. Active citizenship retained property and tax qualifications that excluded a large portion of the population. The new constitutional balance favored property holders and those who feared mass democracy, reflecting Thermidorian priorities. The Directory, as an executive, was meant to be moderate, technocratic, and insulated from immediate popular pressure, but it would face structural weakness from the start. The Directory took office in the autumn of 1795 amid acute social and economic distress. The assignat had depreciated severely, inflation eroded purchasing power, and public finances were precarious. The wartime economy, requisitions, and the selling of national lands had rearranged property relations but had not stabilized revenue. Popular discontent remained high in urban centers, and royalist sentiment persisted in many regions. The Directory's political class proved prone to factionalism and corruption. Directors and deputies cultivated networks of patronage and profit. Ministries changed frequently, and administrations delegated much authority to local notables who often used office for private advantage. That pattern produced a reputation for venality that undermined public legitimacy. At the same time, the Directory confronted recurrent political threats from the left and right. Royalist conspiracies sought to restore the monarchy through electoral gains or direct insurrection. Jacobin or proto-Jacobin groups, resentful of Thermidorian repression and the exclusion of mass democracy, also plotted insurrections. The government relied repeatedly on military force to suppress internal uprisings. In October 1795, a royalist insurrection in Paris culminated in the event known as 13 Vendémiaire, October 5, 1795, when the convention called on troops to defend itself. A young artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, commanded artillery against the insurgents. His effective use of grapeshot and field batteries dispersed the royalists and secured the convention. The episode introduced Napoleon to national prominence and established a template. The government would increasingly depend on military commanders to resolve political crises. Foreign war persisted as a central feature of the Directory's politics. Even after the shock of Thermidor, the Republic continued to prosecute war against the First Coalition. By 1795 to 1797, French arms secured advantages through new operational practices and the mass mobilization that had been institutionalized earlier. Successful field commanders acquired both spoils and political capital. The Directory channeled resources to campaigns that could bring revenue, political advantage, and prestige. It also used military success to legitimize an otherwise brittle government facing domestic opposition. Napoleon's Italian campaign, launched in April 1796, was decisive in shaping the Directory's trajectory. Sent to command the Army of Italy, Napoleon reorganized logistics, emphasized rapid maneuver, and combined political negotiation with military pressure. Over the next year, his forces defeated Piedmontese and Austrian armies, won a string of battles, and negotiated treaties that extended French influence across northern Italy. The Treaty of Campo Formio, concluded in October 1797, formalized significant territorial gains, reconfigured Italian states, and brought material gains in the form of indemnities and art plunder. The success in Italy enhanced the Directory's immediate strategic position, but also revealed the tensions inherent in a government that depended on victorious generals. Commanders accumulated fame, influence, and networks that could challenge civil authority. Military campaigns produced revenue through requisitions and contributions from conquered territories, but they also masked deeper fiscal problems at home. The Directory's reliance on military success to compensate for administrative weakness intensified its dependence on the army as an instrument of politics. That dependence appeared clearly in the coup of 18 Fructidor Year v. September 4, 1797. In that operation, the Directory used military force, notably General Auguero acting under orders aligned with Director Paul Barras, to purge royalist deputies who had won electoral influence. The coup annulled recent elections, deported prominent royalists, and confirmed that the Directory would use arms to control the legislature. The precedent strengthened military intervention as a political tool. The Directory's foreign and domestic policy also produced cultural and political backlash. A government that governed by decree, relied on military interventions in politics, and seemed corrupt, provoked critics from multiple directions. In 1796 and 1797, François-Noël Babeuf and his followers developed egalitarian critiques, later called the conspiracy of the equals, arguing that the revolution had failed to deliver economic equality and that property inequalities persisted. The conspiracy was suppressed in 1796 to 1797, and Babeuf was executed in 1797, but his ideas influenced later egalitarian and socialist currents. Likewise, the Directory's attempt to balance fiscal stability with political moderation led to heavy-handed measures. Press restrictions, censorship, and crackdowns on popular clubs were common. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 represented a different axis of Directory policy. The attempt to undermine British commercial and imperial power by threatening routes to India and to establish French influence in the eastern Mediterranean. Departing in May 1798, Napoleon's campaign combined military aims with scientific and cultural projects. The so-called Commission de Sciences et d'Arts accompanied the army and initiated a wide program of study. Militarily, the campaign achieved immediate tactical success. The French defeated Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21, 1798, but the strategic situation was compromised when Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French Mediterranean fleet at the Battle of the Nile from 1 to 3 August 1798. The destruction of the fleet stranded the army in Egypt and severed the direct link between Napoleon and France, complicating the Directory's ability to control or benefit from the expedition fully. Politically, Egypt expanded Napoleon's reputation among some domestic audiences as a bold commander, but it failed to secure durable strategic gains for France and eventually contributed to the perception of imperial overreach. In the late 1790s, The Directory oscillated between attempts at Republican stabilization and episodic reliance on the army. Parliamentary elections in 1797 to 1798 produced gains by both Royalists and Jacobin sympathizers at different moments. The Directory responded with interventions, such as Fructidor, to preserve its preferred balance. Public confidence in the Directory did not recover fully. Economic grievances persisted. Price instability, weak public finances, and rural unrest continued to plague local authorities. Corruption scandals, sales of offices, profiteering by suppliers, speculation on assignats eroded legitimacy further. The government's repeated recourse to military force to shape politics alienated many who feared the Republic's transformation into a military oligarchy. By 1799, the Directory faced a consolidated political crisis. Military failures in certain theaters, the collapse of law and order in some departments, and a rising tide of public impatience converged. Directors plotted factionally, deputies conspired, and public opinion, fatigued by a decade of upheaval, looked for stability. The military remained the decisive arbiter. Napoleon's return from Egypt at the end of 1799, after slipping past British naval patrols and abandoning much of his army's precarious position, transformed the calculation. His landing in October 1799 and his reception by political factions ready to exploit his popularity made a coup feasible. On 18 Brumaire Year 8, November 9, 1799, Napoleon executed a political takeover that dissolved the Directory and replaced it with the consulate. The coup of 18 Brumaire did not occur in isolation. It followed a sequence of political failures, military prominence, and elite collusion seeking decisive authority. The Directory's inability to sustain civilian governance had made the institutional space in which a military commander could install a new order. The period 1795 to 1799 thus stands as the pivot from revolutionary government characterized by collegial republican experiment to a centralized regime under a single dominant figure. The Directory had aimed to stabilize the revolution by excluding extremes, but its dependence on the army, recurring electoral manipulations, economic mismanagement, and political corruption produced conditions in which the Republic's guardians surrendered initiative to a general who promised order, reform, and national glory. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire, Year 8, Napoleon Bonaparte ended the Directory with a coup that replaced a collegial executive incapable of effective governance with a concentrated authority under the consulate. The new constitution, approved later that year, established the consulate and invested executive power in 3 consuls, with Napoleon as first consul holding the dominant role. The period from late 1799 to 1804 was one of systematic institutional reconstruction. Napoleon sought to stabilize France's normalized public finance, restore order, and build an administrative and legal framework that would both preserve key gains of the revolution and secure state authority. The priority was political consolidation. Napoleon and his ministers moved quickly to neutralize political opponents and to reorganize local government. The system of revolutionary committees and unchecked popular institutions established during the 1790s was curtailed. Political clubs were suppressed, radical newspapers closed, and the press was brought under tighter control through licensing and censorship measures. The Ministry of Police, centralized under officials such as Joseph Fouché, expanded its surveillance, intelligence, and policing functions to detect and prevent conspiracies and unrest. The objective was not to restore the ancien regime, but to prevent political fragmentation and to protect the new order from both royalist restoration and Jacobin resurgence. Administrative centralization accompanied political control. The consulate created a hierarchical, professional civil service that connected Paris to the provinces through appointed agents. Prefects, subprefects, and a reorganized magistrature became the instruments of uniform policy across departments. Local notables retained some influence, but the capacity of central ministries to issue directives and ensure their implementation increased markedly. The administrative reforms standardized tax collection, judicial organization, and local policing. This centralization improved the state's ability to mobilize resources, administer territories, and enforce law and order. Restoration of fiscal credibility and monetary stability was also urgent. Finance ministers reorganized tax administration and re-established reliable channels of revenue. The state revived its ability to borrow on more favorable terms by restoring confidence among commercial and banking interests. In 1800, the Banque de France was established as a private bank with public functions. Its creation stabilized credit, provided a measure of monetary discipline, and reduced the dependence of government finance on the disorderly issue of assignats. The bank's presence in Napoleon's fiscal policies helped curb extreme inflation and restore some predictability to government receipts and expenditures. Legal reform formed a central pillar of Napoleonic governance. The revolution had produced a variety of conflicting local laws and a disordered legal environment. Napoleon's government undertook a systematic codification program to produce uniform, accessible law. Over the early years of the consulate, commissions and jurists drafted codes covering civil, commercial, and penal law. The Civil Code, commonly referred to as the Napoleonic Code, was completed, adopted, and promulgated in 1804. The code consolidated revolutionary legal gains in a single framework. It affirmed property rights, contract enforcement, secular civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths, and the equality of all male citizens before the law. It also restricted corporate privileges and reaffirmed patriarchal family structures in its provisions on marriage and paternal authority. The code's clarity and portability made it an administrative tool for France and, after military expansion, for territories under French control or influence. Napoleon's approach to religion balanced reconciliation with control. The revolution's suppression of traditional ecclesiastical authority and the civil constitution of the clergy had produced years of division and unrest. To pacify society and secure social order, the consulate negotiated an agreement with the Catholic Church. The Concordat of 1801, signed between the first consul and Pope Pius VII, re-established the Catholic Church's public presence in France while preserving state supremacy over church institutions. The Concordat recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens without making it the state religion. It confirmed state payment of clergy salaries and required bishops to be nominated by the first consul and formally confirmed by the Pope. In practice, the Concordat restored a degree of normal religious life and reduced rural and urban tensions arising from the earlier anti-clerical measures. But it also subordinated the Church to a reconstituted relationship of state control. The government supplemented the Concordat with administrative rules that regulated the clergy's public role and limited papal influence over French internal affairs. These measures asserted national law as the primary framework for ecclesiastical activity. Education and meritocratic recruitment were important components of Napoleon's state building. The consulate moved to re-establish state control over secondary and higher education to produce a core of administrative and military professionals loyal to the regime. New secondary schools, lycées, were created to provide standardized instruction, particularly in mathematics, science, and modern languages, and to channel graduates into the civil service and military academies. The university system and technical schools were reorganized to train specialists and administrators. Consequently, the state gained a predictable pipeline of qualified personnel for the expanding bureaucracy and army. Fiscal reforms went alongside institutional modernization. The government introduced clearer systems of taxation and reformed indirect taxes to improve collection and to limit evasion. Public works programs, roads, canals, and bridges facilitated commerce and troop movement and created state-sponsored employment that stabilized regions. The state also reorganized the cadastral system. Systematic land surveys improved the tax base and produced legally recognized property titles that supported the Code's emphasis on property rights. The consulate strengthened the military while reforming its institutions. The revolution's levy en masse had created mass armies. Under Napoleon, the army became a more professional institution with improved command structures, logistical planning, and standardized training. Promotion increasingly depended on merit and battlefield performance, a revolutionary legacy that Napoleon preserved. The armored scale of mobilization and the improved logistics allowed France to project power beyond its borders while maintaining internal security. Diplomacy under the consulate was pragmatic and aimed at consolidating gains achieved by relative military success and at limiting the risk of coordinated foreign intervention. Napoleon's government negotiated treaties and territorial settlements that reorganized parts of Italy and the German lands in ways favorable to French strategic interests. In some cases, the consulate preferred to export legal and administrative systems rather than rule directly. In others, it installed client regimes or preferred to secure buffer zones against hostile coalitions. Economic measures, most prominently the continental system initiated during the later empire, were prepared in part during this period as attempts to weaken Britain's economic strength, but the consulate's primary diplomatic aims in its first years were to secure France's borders and to gain formal recognition from major powers when feasible. The consulate addressed questions of social order and class relations. While preserving property and many of the revolution's measures, the government restrained political expression and suppressed organizations that could challenge the regime. The repression of radical egalitarian movements, such as conspiracies advocating communal ownership or leveling, prevented social experiments that had emerged during the Terror's more radical phase. At the same time, the state encouraged veterans' pensions, awards, and honors to secure the loyalty of veterans and military officers. Titles and honors were sometimes reintroduced in modified forms, decorations, and numbered ranks, allowing Napoleon to reward service while avoiding a full return to hereditary aristocracy. The consulate also managed colonial and external questions with mixed tactics. Where useful, it preserved commercial and administrative ties. Where conflict with Britain or other powers was unavoidable, it prepared for military confrontation. The Egyptian expedition, launched under Napoleon in 1798 before his return to seize power, had demonstrated both the strategic ambition and the limits of overseas ventures. After consolidating power, the consulate was cautious in projecting power across oceans without secure naval superiority. Legal and institutional reforms had an ideological dimension. Napoleon and his advisors framed their program as securing the revolution's useful achievements: equality before the law, property security, administrative rationality, while eliminating its perceived excesses, political paralyzes, factional violence, and economic disorder. That framing justified a strong executive and centralized institutions, but it also meant that political liberties were curtailed in favor of predictability and order. Censorship, policing, and a system of patronage limited free political contestation, shaping the political life of France for years to come. By 1804, the reorganization of state structures, the stabilization of finance, the codification of law, the reconciliation with the Catholic Church, and the professionalization of the military had produced a government that combined revolutionary legality with centralized authority. The institutional foundations laid during the consulate, civil service hierarchies, legal codes, a stabilized currency, and state-managed education, provided the administrative capacity Napoleon would employ during the imperial phase. The consolidation of power under a single dominant executive, however, also prepared the ground for a transition from republican institutions toward a personal regime centered on Napoleon himself. On May 18, 1804, the French Senate proclaimed Napoleon Bonaparte Emperor of the French, formally transforming the consulate into the First French Empire. The move was ratified by a national plebiscite, and on December 2, 1804, Napoleon crowned himself in the presence of Pope Pius VII at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The act symbolized the supremacy of state authority over the Church and the consolidation of personal rule under imperial form. By 1804, France possessed a disciplined army, a codified legal system, stable finances, and centralized administration, the framework upon which Napoleon would build a continental empire. The first years of the empire coincided with renewed conflict in Europe. Britain had never accepted French dominance on the continent and continued its naval blockade and subsidies to continental coalitions. In May 1803, before Napoleon's coronation, war had resumed between France and Britain following the breakdown of the Peace of Amiens, 1802. Napoleon assembled the Armée d'Angleterre at Boulogne, intending to invade Britain, but the French fleet's inferiority to the Royal Navy made invasion impractical. The failure of the combined Franco-Spanish fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar, October 21, 1805, confirmed British naval supremacy and ensured that the struggle between France and Britain would remain primarily continental and economic rather than maritime. On land, Napoleon faced the Third Coalition, 1805, composed of Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. He responded with rapid mobilization and strategic maneuvering. Abandoning plans to invade Britain, he redirected his army eastward, crossing the Rhine and surrounding Austrian forces at Ulm. The Austrian surrender at Ulm, October 1805, marked a decisive operational victory. Soon after, Napoleon defeated the combined Austrian and Russian armies at Austerlitz, December 2, 1805, often considered his greatest tactical achievement. The victory dissolved the Third Coalition and led to the Treaty of Pressburg, December 26, 1805, which forced Austria to cede territory and pay indemnities, consolidating French influence in Central Europe. Following the disintegration of the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon reorganized German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, 1806, placing them under French protection. This act effectively ended the Holy Roman Empire, which Francis II formally dissolved in August 1806. Prussia, alarmed by the expansion of French power, joined a new Fourth Coalition, 1806 to 1807, with Russia, Saxony, and Britain. Napoleon's forces crushed the Prussian army at Jena and Auerstedt, October 14, 1806, occupying Berlin shortly after. His troops marched eastward into Poland, where he faced the Russians. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Friedland, June 14, 1807, where Napoleon decisively defeated the Russian army. The resulting treaties of Tilsit, July 1807, between France, Russia, and Prussia restructured Europe once again. Prussia lost about half its territory. Russia accepted French hegemony in Western and Central Europe, and both powers agreed to cooperate against Britain through the Continental System, an embargo designed to exclude British goods from European markets. The Continental System, decreed by Napoleon's Berlin Decree, November 1806, and extended by the Milan Decree, 1807, sought to cripple Britain's trade by closing continental ports to British merchants. However, the policy produced mixed results. While it hurt certain sectors of British commerce, it also damaged European economies dependent on colonial goods and maritime trade. Smuggling and neutral shipping undermined enforcement, and discontent spread in occupied and allied territories. During this period, Napoleon's empire expanded through both conquest and dynastic placement. His family members and loyal marshals governed dependent states across Europe. Joseph Bonaparte became King of Naples, 1806, and later King of Spain, 1808. Louis Bonaparte ruled the Netherlands, and his brother-in-law Joachim Murat took control of Naples after Joseph's transfer. French administrative, legal, and fiscal systems were introduced across the empire, spreading the civil code and secular state institutions. Yet these reforms often served imperial control as much as modernization. The next major conflict emerged in the Iberian Peninsula. In 1807, France and Spain signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau, allowing French troops to cross Spain to invade Portugal, a British ally. Napoleon used this as a pretext to occupy Spain itself. In 1808, he forced the abdication of King Charles IV and Ferdinand VII, installing Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. The Spanish population rose in revolt, beginning the Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814. British forces under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, supported Spanish and Portuguese resistance. The brutal guerrilla warfare drained French resources and tied down hundreds of thousands of troops, becoming a persistent weakness in Napoleon's military system. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, Austria sought to recover from its earlier defeats. The War of the Fifth Coalition, 1809, began with Austrian advances into Bavaria, but Napoleon's counteroffensive led to the Battle of Wagram, 5–6 July 1809, where he achieved a hard-fought victory. The Treaty of Schönbrunn, October 1809, imposed heavy penalties on Austria, ceding territories and reinforcing French dominance. To strengthen dynastic legitimacy and alliance, Napoleon divorced Josephine de Beauharnais in 1810 and married Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria, in April 1810. Their son, the King of Rome, Napoleon II, was born in March 1811, symbolizing the attempted fusion of revolutionary and dynastic legitimacy. By 1811, the Napoleonic Empire reached its maximum territorial extent either through direct annexation or control of allied states, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, Western Germany, Poland, as the Duchy of Warsaw, and the Illyrian provinces were under French rule or influence. Yet beneath this expansion lay a growing strain. The continental system bred resentment and economic distress. National resistance movements intensified in Spain, Italy, and Germany. Relations with Russia deteriorated as Tsar Alexander I increasingly resented the economic consequences of the blockade and Napoleon's interference in Polish affairs. In June 1812, Napoleon launched the invasion of Russia, assembling the Grande Army, a force of over 600,000 men drawn from across the empire. The campaign's initial progress was rapid. The French crossed the Niemen River and advanced through Smolensk toward Moscow. The Russians avoided decisive engagement, retreating while employing scorched-earth tactics. The major confrontation came at the Battle of Borodino, September 7, 1812, one of the bloodiest of the era, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides, but no decisive breakthrough. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14, 1812, finding it largely abandoned and soon consumed by fire. Unable to secure a peace, he ordered a retreat in October amid worsening weather and supply collapse. The retreat turned catastrophic. Cold, hunger, disease, and harassment by Russian forces destroyed most of the Grande Army. By December, fewer than 100,000 survivors recrossed into Poland. The disaster in Russia shattered the myth of French invincibility. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition, comprising Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Sweden, and others, rose against Napoleon. The spring campaign of 1813 brought temporary French victories at Lutzen, May 2nd, and Bautzen, 20–21 May, but the Allies regrouped. At the Battle of Leipzig, 16–19 October 1813, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon suffered a decisive defeat. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed as German states defected to the Allies. French forces retreated across the Rhine, and Allied armies advanced into France. The campaigns of 1814 demonstrated Napoleon's resilience, but also the exhaustion of France. Despite tactical successes in the Six Days Campaign, February 1814, overwhelming Allied numbers forced a steady retreat. Paris fell on March 31, 1814, and Napoleon abdicated unconditionally on April 6, 1814. The Allies restored the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII. Napoleon was granted sovereignty over the island of Elba, where he arrived in May 1814. The peace settlement began at the Congress of Vienna, 1814–1815, where European powers sought to restore balance and stability. However, Napoleon's exile lasted less than a year. On February 26, 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France. His arrival sparked a wave of support. The army rallied to him, and he entered Paris on March 20, 1815, beginning the period known as the 100 Days. The Allies immediately formed the Seventh Coalition to oppose him. Napoleon reorganized his forces but faced superior numbers. On June 18, 1815, he met the British and Prussian armies at the Battle of Waterloo. Despite fierce fighting, the French army was routed after the arrival of Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher's Prussian troops in the afternoon. Napoleon fled to Paris, abdicated for the second time on June 22, 1815, and surrendered to the British on July 15, 1815. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he remained under strict supervision until his death on May 5, 1821. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, reshaped Europe's political geography, dismantled feudal institutions, and spread administrative, legal, and nationalist ideas. The French Empire's collapse concluded a quarter-century of revolutionary conflict that began in 1789, leaving behind both destruction and the foundations of modern European governance and law. The period from 1808 to 1812 marks a decisive shift in the Napoleonic conflicts. French military expansion met prolonged popular resistance. The resources required to hold occupied territories increased, and the continental system's economic pressure contributed to diplomatic rupture with Russia. The sequence begins on the Iberian Peninsula and expands to include wider political and economic strains that shaped Napoleon's strategic choices. In 1807, France and Spain signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau, October 27, 1807, permitting French troops to cross Spain to attack Portugal. The ostensible objective was the enforcement of the continental system against Britain by denying Portuguese ports to British trade. French forces entered Portugal, but successive deployments remained in Spanish territory. Political manipulation followed. In March, May 1808, against a background of royal family quarrels and political intrigue, Napoleon forced the abdication of the Spanish king, Charles IV, and his son Ferdinand VII, and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. The process of dynastic replacement took place rapidly and with limited consultation of Spanish institutions. Many Spaniards perceived it as a foreign seizure rather than a legitimate succession. Popular reaction was immediate and violent. On May 2, 1808, an uprising against French troops in Madrid, commonly known as the Dos de Mayo uprising, erupted. Urban crowds attacked patrols and French detachments. The insurrection was suppressed with severe reprisals, including summary executions by firing squads on May 3, 1808 at the Prado and other locations. The repression inflamed resistance nationwide. Provincial juntas, local governing committees, formed to coordinate military resistance and to claim legitimacy in the absence of a recognized central authority. These juntas convened in cities such as Seville, Valencia, and Asturias and coordinated recruitment, financing, and irregular warfare. Military consequences followed. On July 19, 1808, Spanish forces under General Castanos defeated a French army at Belen, capturing thousands of French troops. The Battle of Belen, 19–22 July 1808, was the first major regular army defeat of Napoleon's forces in open combat and had significant psychological and strategic effects. It forced the temporary withdrawal of French troops from much of Andalusia and inspired broader resistance across Spain. The defeat compelled Napoleon to redirect significant resources to secure his rear, expose French lines of communication, and attempt to pacify a hostile population. The Peninsular War developed two parallel but interlocking forms of conflict. First, conventional operations were undertaken by French field armies. often commanded by marshals such as Murat, Soult, and Ney, seeking to control cities, fortresses, and lines of communication. Second, and perhaps more consequential in the long term, irregular warfare proliferated. Small bands of Spanish fighters, termed guerrilleros, attacked isolated detachments, disrupted convoys, ambushed foraging parties, and sabotaged bridges and roads. The term guerrilla entered the military vocabulary in this period to describe these tactics. Guerrilla warfare forced the French to commit disproportionately large numbers of troops to policing and security duties, reducing the effective strength available for major campaigns elsewhere. British intervention reinforced Spanish resistance. In August 1808, an Anglo-Portuguese expedition under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, landed on the Portuguese coast. British forces fought engagements at Rolica, August 17, 1808, and Vimero, August 21, 1808, defeating a French corps under General Junot. Political developments following these victories led to the Convention of Sintra, August 30, 1808, which allowed the evacuation of French troops from Portugal under terms many in Britain found dishonorable. Wellesley's involvement would grow in scale and importance over subsequent years. The British presence provided material support, training, and a conventional ally that helped sustain the Spanish cause. The Peninsular conflict extended into 1809 and beyond. After initial setbacks, Napoleon committed more of his senior commanders and reserves to Spain and Portugal. British and Portuguese forces under Wellesley, learning from early operations, improved their logistical and tactical posture. Wellesley won a notable but costly victory at the Battle of Talavera, 27–28 July 1809, alongside Spanish allies. The battle demonstrated that coordinated Allied forces could stand against French formations, although strategic follow-through remained difficult. In January 1809, British General Sir John Moore conducted a daring winter campaign that culminated in the Battle of Corunna, January 16, 1809. During the British retreat, Moore was killed in action, but his army was evacuated to Britain. The British experience in the peninsula underscored the difficulty of sustaining continental campaigns without secure bases and reliable supply lines. From 1809 to 1810, French efforts to secure the peninsula produced mixed results. The occupation of Spanish urban centers and the imposition of French administrative systems provoked continued resistance. Wellesley's appointment to command Anglo-Portuguese forces in 1809 marked a turning point. He prioritized training, supply, and the improvement of Portuguese regular forces. By 1810, after the French invasion of Portugal under Marshal Massena, Wellesley implemented a defensive strategy centered on the lines of Torres Vedras, a secret system of fortifications north of Lisbon constructed in 1809 to 1810. The lines, combined with scorched earth measures and disciplined defensive logistics, forced the French to withdraw in 1811 due to supply collapse and disease. The Peninsular War gradually exhausted French manpower and diverted veteran corps that otherwise might have reinforced campaigns in Central and Eastern Europe. Conditions on the continent were affected by the economic policies of the continental system. Napoleon's Berlin Decree, November 21, 1806, and the later Milan Decree, December 17, 1807, sought to exclude British goods from European ports. Implementation required policing of coasts and control over neutral shipping, and it imposed restrictive trade measures on dependent and allied states. Enforcement was imperfect. Smuggling and neutral trade, particularly via the Russian Empire and the United States, often circumvented embargoes. Protectionist measures and the loss of profitable colonial trade damaged merchants and consumers in continental markets. In Spain and Portugal, the disruption of commerce, combined with requisitions and contributions levied by occupying armies, generated widespread economic distress. The continental system also strained relations with Russia. Tsar Alexander I had initially cooperated with Napoleon following the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807, but by 1810 to 1811, Russian officials and merchants increasingly resisted the economic harm caused by the blockade. Russia's agricultural exports, especially grain, and its need for manufactured imports made enforcement costly. Diplomatic friction escalated over the status of the Duchy of Warsaw, where Polish aspirations for statehood intersected with Russian security concerns. Napoleon's expansion of influence in Central Europe and his support for Polish state structures alarmed Alexander. Trade disputes, protectionist impulses in Russia, and mutual suspicion produced a diplomatic breakdown in 1811. Military and administrative occupation in the peninsula aggravated the French position. The need to garrison fortresses, secure supply depots, and suppress guerrilla activity required concentrations of troops dispersed across a wide area. High casualty rates from disease and attrition, as well as continued desertions and local resistance, increased French casualties beyond those suffered in set-piece battles. Spanish guerrillas, acting independently of conventional Spanish armies, inflicted continual attrition and forced the French to rely on punitive expeditions that produced brutality and hardened resistance. The conflict's character, intense local hostility combined with international intervention, made the peninsula a strategic sink for French resources. By 1812, the cumulative effect of the Peninsular War and the continental system had altered European strategic balances. Napoleon's need to secure European hegemony, while controlling a restless Iberia and enforcing an imperfect economic blockade, placed conflicting demands on available forces. Diplomacy with Russia failed to resolve trade and political disputes. In this context, the decision to invade Russia in June 1812 was shaped not only by grand strategic aims, but by the immediate burdens of maintaining control over peripheral theaters such as the Iberian Peninsula and by the economic warfare forced on continental states. Concurrently, the Spanish political landscape evolved. In the absence of a functioning central monarchy, Spanish representatives met in Cortes and elsewhere to articulate constitutional governance. The Cortes of Cortes, convened intermittently from 1810, worked to produce a constitutional framework. It promulgated the Spanish Constitution on March 19, 1812, known as the Constitution of Cortes. The Constitution declared national sovereignty, established representative government, affirmed civil rights, and abolished feudal dues in Spanish territories under the Cortes authority. Although the Constitution had an immediate limited effect in territory controlled by Joseph Bonaparte, it provided a legal and political foundation for post-war Spanish governance and for liberal movements across Europe. The defeat of the Grande Armée in Russia in 1812 removed France's long-standing strategic advantage. Napoleon entered 1813, attempting to rebuild his forces in Germany from a mix of conscripts, veterans returning from Russia, foreign contingents, and troops drawn from satellites and garrisons. He launched a spring offensive aimed at preventing a unified coalition from forming and to regain the operational initiative. Early 1813 operations, including engagements at Lutzen, May 2, 1813, and Bautzen, 20–21 May 1813, produced tactical French successes. Both battles compelled coalition withdrawals but failed to achieve decisive strategic results. Heavy casualties and the lack of a reliable base for sustained operations limited Napoleon's ability to convert battlefield victories into a stable front. Diplomatic developments during the summer of 1813 changed the balance. Austria, which had remained neutral and acted as a potential mediator in previous years, shifted position as Emperor Francis I and his statesmen judged French power weakened and opportunities for territorial readjustment feasible. Austria entered the coalition formally in August 1813, committing significant forces and opening a new front in Central Europe. The coalition coordinated strategy, pooling resources and aiming for a decisive engagement that could break French capacity for continental domination. The decisive confrontation occurred in the autumn of 1813. Napoleon attempted to prevent the junction of coalition columns and to isolate segments of enemy forces, but coalition armies under the direction of Russian, Prussian, and Austrian commanders, particularly Field Marshal Prince Karl Schwarzenberg and Prince von Blücher on the Prussian side, cooperated more effectively than in earlier coalitions. The culminating battle, Leipzig, 16–19 October 1813, also called the Battle of Nations, involved over 500,000 combatants and represented a strategic coalition victory. Napoleon, confronted with converging enemy armies and reduced strategic reserves, was forced into a general retreat. The defeat at Leipzig shattered the Confederation of the Rhine. Several German states defected to the coalition, withdrew their contingents from French command, and opened their territories to Allied advance. The collapse of Allied satellite support removed manpower, logistical depth, and political legitimacy from French dominance in Central Europe. Following Leipzig, coalition forces pushed westward and crossed the Rhine into French territory in late 1813 and early 1814. Allied armies operated on multiple axes, invading from the east and the south. Napoleon responded with a series of defensive operations designed to delay the invaders and to concentrate forces locally where possible, but he lacked the mass of troops available earlier in his career. The economy of France had been strained for years by requisitions, conscription, taxation, and the fallout of the continental system. Recruitment struggled to replace losses, and desertion rates rose. Moreover, the quality of recruits was uneven. Many new conscripts lacked the training and experience of the veterans lost in Russia. The coalition invasion combined conventional campaigns with political pressure. Allied diplomacy offered terms of peace in parallel with military operations, terms that would end Napoleonic rule and restore legitimate monarchs in Europe. Within France, war weariness was significant. Urban and rural communities suffered requisitions, billeting, and conscription. Local elites and marshals who had been loyal to Napoleon began to reassess their position as the strategic picture deteriorated. The erosion of support among senior officers and political elites reduced Napoleon's ability to sustain national mobilization. Despite strategic disadvantages, Napoleon demonstrated operational skill during the winter and early spring of 1814, conducting what contemporaries later called the 6 Days Campaign. From 10 to 14 February 1814, Napoleon achieved a sequence of tactical victories against elements of the coalition in northeastern France, most notably at Champaubert, February 10th, Montmirail, February 11th, Châlons-en-Champagne, February 12th, and Vauchamps, February 14th. These engagements inflicted heavy losses on coalition corps and temporarily disrupted their converging plans. The victories showcased Napoleon's flexibility in maneuver, his use of interior lines, and his capacity to concentrate forces for local superiority. Nevertheless, the coalition's numerical advantage and its ability to absorb losses meant these tactical successes could not translate into a strategic reversal. Allied commanders simply reconcentrated larger forces and resumed offensive operations. By March 1814, coalition armies, operating along multiple axes with converging columns, advanced on Paris. The Allied command coordinated movements from the north, east, and south. Napoleon made determined attempts to defend Paris and to strike isolated enemy forces, but the disparity in overall strength was decisive. The political situation in Paris and within France deteriorated as mounting casualties, requisition burdens, and economic dislocation eroded the regime's social base. Some provincial authorities and notables began to consider negotiation with the coalition as a way to spare localities further devastation. The fall of Paris was the immediate precondition for political collapse. On 30 to 31 March 1814, after intense fighting on the approaches to the capital, Allied forces entered Paris. The city's defenses, undermanned and overstretched, could not hold against coordinated assault. French field forces were no longer sufficient to defend the capital against the assembled coalition armies. The occupation of Paris produced immediate political consequences. Members of the Senate and other leading figures signaled willingness to negotiate an end to Napoleonist rule. In the face of military defeat and loss of elite support, Napoleon abdicated unconditionally on April 6, 1814. The abdication was followed by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed on April 11. Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate power and to present his return as a continuation of the revolution rather than a restoration of imperial autocracy. He promised liberal reforms, issued the act additional to the 1814 Charter on April 22, 1815, and sought to rally both army and civil service around him. Nonetheless, the European powers, still assembled at Vienna, responded immediately. On March 13, 1815, they declared Napoleon an outlaw, and on March 25, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia renewed their alliance, committing to deploy their armies to defeat him once more. Napoleon recognized that only a rapid, decisive victory could preserve his position. He raised an army of approximately 200,000 men, but much of it consisted of hastily recalled veterans and raw recruits. Facing him, the coalition assembled armies under the Duke of Wellington in Belgium and Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher commanding the Prussian forces. Napoleon planned to strike preemptively between them, defeat each in detail, and compel a negotiated peace before larger coalition forces could mobilize. The campaign began on June 15, 1815, when French forces crossed into Belgium. Napoleon won his initial engagement at Ligny on June 16, defeating Blücher's Prussians. However, the simultaneous battle at Quatre Bras, where Marshal Ney engaged Wellington, ended indecisively and allowed the Anglo-Allied army to retreat in good order. The Prussians, though beaten, were not destroyed. Blücher withdrew north toward Wavre and maintained communication with Wellington. Napoleon underestimated the speed and determination with which the Prussians would rejoin the campaign. The decisive encounter occurred near Waterloo on June 18, 1815. Napoleon deployed approximately 73,000 troops against Wellington's 68,000, positioned along the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge. The battle opened with French attacks on the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont, followed by assaults on La Haye-Sainte and Pays-Plate. Repeated French infantry and cavalry charges under Ney failed to break the Allied center, while persistent rain and muddy ground impeded artillery effectiveness. Around mid-afternoon, the Prussian army under Blücher began arriving on Napoleon's right flank, attacking French positions at Plancenoit. Despite fierce resistance, the combined Anglo-Allied and Prussian pressure eventually overwhelmed the French lines. As the evening advanced, Wellington ordered a general advance. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve, made a final assault but was repelled. The collapse of the Guard triggered a general French rout. Napoleon withdrew from the field and reached Paris on June 21, 1815. The defeat at Waterloo decisively ended his bid to maintain power. Coalition forces advanced rapidly toward Paris, and political opposition in the capital hardened. The Chamber of Representatives demanded his abdication. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time, naming his son, styled Napoleon II, as successor, though the coalition refused to recognize the claim. Napoleon sought asylum in Britain, but was refused permission to settle on the mainland. He surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland aboard HMS Bellerophon on July 15, 1815, expecting possible internment in Britain. The British government, determined to prevent any renewed political threat, instead decided to exile him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic under British control. He arrived there in October 1815. The British placed him under strict supervision commanded by Sir Hudson Lowe, with limited correspondence and controlled access to visitors. The Second Bourbon Restoration followed. Louis XVIII returned to Paris on July 8, 1815 under Allied occupation. The coalition powers imposed the Second Treaty of Paris on November 20, 1815, which reduced France's borders to those of 1790, required an indemnity of 700 million francs, and placed parts of the country under Allied occupation for 5 years. France also surrendered key frontier fortresses and returned art and treasures looted during the wars. The Congress of Vienna, which concluded its final act on June 9, 1815, had already reshaped the European map. The Netherlands and Belgium were united as the Kingdom of the United Netherlands to counterbalance France. Prussia expanded westward along the Rhine. Austria regained Lombardy and Venetia, consolidating its influence in Italy. Russia established the Kingdom of Poland under the Tsar's authority. The German Confederation replaced the dissolved Holy Roman Empire as a loose association of 39 states under Austrian presidency. Britain retained overseas colonies gained during the wars, including strategic naval bases such as Malta and the Cape Colony. Napoleon's exile on St. Helena marked the definitive end of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era. From 1815 onward, European diplomacy operated within the framework of the Concert of Europe, an informal system of great power consultation designed to preserve the Vienna settlement and suppress revolutionary movements. Although revolutions would recur later in the 19th century, the period from 1815 to 1848 remained one of relative continental stability compared to the preceding quarter century of upheaval. Napoleon lived on St. Helena until his death on May 5, 1821, aged 51. An autopsy conducted by the British surgeon Francis Burton recorded the cause as stomach cancer, though speculation about poisoning persisted. His remains were interred on the island until 1840, when they were transferred to France and reburied with full honors in the Dôme des Invalides in Paris during the reign of Louis Philippe. The wars from 1789 to 1815 transformed Europe's political, legal, and social foundations. They spread the principles of the French Revolution, abolition of feudal privilege, codified law, and secular administration, while also demonstrating the destructive potential of total mobilization and nationalist warfare. The Napoleonic era redefined modern statecraft, warfare, and diplomacy, leaving institutions and ideas that shaped the 19th century and beyond. The period following 1815 marked a decisive shift in European and global history. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, spanning from 1789 to 1815, had altered the political, social, and intellectual framework of the Western world. The aftermath saw the consolidation of reforms initiated during the Revolution and accelerated under Napoleon, even as the monarchies of Europe attempted to restore pre-revolutionary order. The Congress of Vienna, which concluded in June 1815, redrew the political boundaries of Europe. Its architects, Metternich of Austria, Castlereagh of Britain, Alexander I of Russia, and Hardenberg of Prussia, sought to establish a durable balance of power to prevent any single state from dominating the continent again. France was restored under the Bourbon dynasty, but the territorial adjustments favored the victors. Austria regained control of northern Italy and parts of the Balkans. Prussia expanded westward into the Rhineland and northward into Saxony, and Russia extended influence through the creation of the Kingdom of Poland under the Tsar's authority. The settlement aimed to suppress revolutionary change. The Concert of Europe, a diplomatic system of regular congresses and great power cooperation, was designed to maintain stability and to collectively intervene against revolutions. Despite this conservative framework, many of the political and social transformations initiated between 1789 and 1815 endured. The destruction of feudalism, the spread of codified laws, and the consolidation of administrative institutions had become irreversible components of modern statecraft. The Napoleonic Code, promulgated in 1804, represented one of the most enduring legacies of the era. It established legal equality, protection of private property, and secular civil authority. The code served as a model for legal systems in Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia and Africa. In France, it remained the foundation of the civil law system. Beyond the legal sphere, Napoleonic administrative reforms created a centralized bureaucracy based on merit rather than birth, standardizing taxation, education, and provincial governance. These changes shaped the structure of the modern state throughout the 19th century. The French Revolution had introduced a new political vocabulary centered on citizenship, rights, and national sovereignty. The abolition of the estates system and feudal privileges redefined the relationship between individuals and the state. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789 had proclaimed that sovereignty resided in the nation, not in the monarch. Though monarchies were restored after 1815, the concept of popular sovereignty persisted and continued to influence subsequent movements for constitutional government. The spread of nationalism was one of the most far-reaching consequences of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era. The wars had redrawn borders and mobilized populations on an unprecedented scale. Napoleon's reorganization of German and Italian territories undermined the old dynastic and feudal order, creating conditions for future national unification movements. The German Confederation, established in 1815 under Austrian presidency, replaced the Holy Roman Empire but also sowed the seeds of German nationalism. In Italy, the territorial consolidation under Napoleonic rule inspired later efforts toward unification in the mid-19th century. In Spain and its colonies, the Napoleonic occupation and the collapse of royal authority stimulated independence movements across Latin America. Between 1810 and 1824, leaders such as Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Miguel Hidalgo initiated struggles that led to the end of Spanish colonial rule in most of the Americas. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and national self-determination resonated across continents, even where they were adapted to local contexts. Within Europe, the social structure had been permanently altered. The revolutionary abolition of feudal dues, the sale of church lands, and the redistribution of property created a new class of landowners and reinforced the rise of the bourgeoisie. The clergy and nobility no longer held exclusive legal privileges, and the principle of meritocracy, promoted through both revolutionary and Napoleonic institutions, expanded access to public office. Education reforms, including the establishment of state-controlled lycées under Napoleon, strengthened the intellectual foundations of a more literate and bureaucratically competent society. The wars had also transformed military organization and strategy. The levy en masse, first implemented in 1793, introduced the concept of national conscription. Armies became mass forces representing the nation rather than the monarch. Napoleonic warfare emphasized mobility, corps organization, and coordination of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, methods that influenced military doctrine well into the 20th century. The experience of total mobilization required efficient logistics, intelligence, and command structures, prompting administrative modernization in all major European states. Economically, the period disrupted traditional trade networks but accelerated modernization. Continental blockade policies during the Napoleonic era stimulated domestic industry and infrastructure. After 1815, Britain emerged as the leading global industrial and maritime power. The decline of French dominance coincided with the expansion of the British Empire and the consolidation of its naval supremacy. The wars had demonstrated the economic and strategic value of industrial capacity, influencing state policies in the decades that followed. Intellectually, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic years reshaped European thought. The Enlightenment's rationalism had provided the revolution's ideological foundation, but the experience of mass mobilization, warfare, and state centralization generated new political philosophies. Conservatism, articulated by figures such as Edmund Burke and later Joseph de Maistre, arose in reaction to revolutionary excesses, emphasizing order, tradition, and authority. Liberalism, emerging from the same era, advocated constitutional limits, representative government, and civil liberties. Nationalism evolved as a cultural and political force that would dominate 19th century European politics. The impact of these transformations extended beyond Europe. In the Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, directly inspired by events in France, resulted in the first successful slave revolt, leading to an independent state governed by former slaves. The French abolition of slavery in 1794 and its reimposition under Napoleon in 1802 revealed the contradictions of revolutionary universalism. Nevertheless, the principle that human rights were not confined to Europe had entered global discourse. In North Africa and the Middle East, Napoleon's Egyptian expedition, 1798 to 1801, marked the beginning of modern European engagement with the region. The campaign introduced European scientific and administrative methods to Egypt and initiated a new phase of imperial and cultural interaction that would expand throughout the 19th century. Domestically, post-Napoleonic France retained many institutions created between 1789 and 1815. The centralized administration, legal codes, and secular education system continued under the restored monarchy and subsequent regimes. The revolution's promise of political participation and equality before the law remained part of French political life, influencing the revolutions of 1830, 1848, and later Republican movements. For the rest of Europe, the settlement of 1815 provided 4 decades of relative peace among the great powers. Yet beneath this surface stability, the legacy of the French Revolution persisted. Popular movements demanding constitutional rights, national independence, and social reform periodically challenged the conservative order established at Vienna. The revolutionary ideals of citizenship, equality, and national identity became permanent components of modern political thought. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars collectively represented the transition from the Ancien regime to the modern world. They redefined the nature of governance, the structure of society, and the conduct of war. The institutions and ideologies formed during this era influenced constitutional developments, independence movements, and political reform across the globe for the next 2 centuries.